Hey guys, tonight we are not going to start with a king in a velvet chair or a general leaning over a map like he personally invented geometry. We are going somewhere much quieter, somewhere more ordinary. We are going to a weekday morning, a completely unremarkable one. Bread in the oven, a child whining about something tiny and urgent, a bucket getting knocked over, somebody muttering a word that definitely should not be said in front of the children, and yet there it is, floating around the kitchen before breakfast. The strange thing about history is that it almost never pauses on that moment. It likes coronations and explosions and declarations. It does not usually stop to notice the final normal Tuesday. So tonight, pull the blanket up, let your shoulders go loose, and just settle in with that thought for a while. Before every plague, every fire, every invasion, every collapse, there was one last morning when people were still doing the usual things. They were still grumbling about flour prices, still looking for a missing shoe, still planning for next week as if next week had signed some binding agreement to arrive in one piece. It never had, of course. History is rude like that. Let's drift over to London. Early spring, 1665. The city is large, loud, and fragrant in all the least poetic ways. About 500,000 people are packed into a place with no modern sewage system, a lot of animals, a lot of mud, a lot of smoke, and a truly heroic amount of human confidence. Londoners were used to the smell. People get used to almost anything, which is one of humanity's great strengths, and also, occasionally, the reason we walk directly into disasters with a shrug. In the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, on the western edge of the city, a baker woke before sunrise. We do not know his surname. History, in one of its more irritating habits, saved the best paperwork for nobles and left working people blurry around the edges. So we will call him Thomas, because there were a great many Thomases, and because it feels right for a London baker in 1665 to be named Thomas. He got up in the dark. He checked the fire. He worked the dough. He thought about the day's sales. Bread would not bake itself, and the city, inconsiderately, still expected breakfast. He knew his neighborhood by sound more than by sight. The hammer from the Cartwright's place 2 doors down, the scrape of shutters opening, the widow across the lane who sometimes sang while she worked and sometimes did not, which told you rather a lot about the mood of the morning. Children darting through alleys, someone arguing over a pail, someone chasing a chicken that had made a deeply personal decision to become unavailable. It was a real place. That matters. Not a stage set for a plague. Just a neighborhood full of ordinary people doing ordinary things. And that morning, as far as Thomas could tell, nothing was wrong. That is the part that always lingers. Not that something terrible was coming. History is full of terrible things coming. It is that while it was coming, while the first links in the chain were already in motion, life still felt normal from ground level. Somewhere nearby, maybe in a yard, maybe in a cellar, maybe in a warehouse where nobody was paying much attention, a rat carried fleas. Somewhere before that, a ship had docked with cargo from Amsterdam. Somewhere before that, goods had moved through trade routes reaching farther east, where plague had already circulated. The bacterium involved was Yersinia pestis, though no one in London knew that name and would not for another 2 centuries. In 1665, there was no germ theory. There were bad airs, divine displeasure, unlucky constitutions, suspicious neighborhoods, and a lot of guessing with terrific confidence. People did know one thing. Sometimes a sickness appeared. People developed painful swellings under the arms or in the groin. Fevers followed. Then burial followed. Why? Nobody could say. Which is honestly a hard way to run a civilization, but humanity managed for quite a long time on exactly that basis. In the early weeks, the signs were small. The London bills of mortality, the weekly printed death counts, began to show a rise in burials around St. Giles. Not an apocalyptic rise, not the sort of thing that makes people sprint for the gates. Just a little increase, slightly above usual. The sort of number that lets everyone continue with market day because surely if it were serious, it would be more obvious than that. Human beings are deeply committed to the idea that disaster should arrive with better branding. Samuel Pepys, who, bless him, was one of history's great diarists and also one of its greatest reminders that ordinary people love gossip in every century, noticed the shift as the spring turned towards summer. On June 7, 1665, he wrote about seeing houses marked with red crosses. Those crosses meant plague inside. The household was shut up, a watchman stood outside. Food might be passed in, but nobody was meant to leave. Imagine the speed with which a normal home becomes a little prison. One week you are complaining about laundry. The next week, your front door has become a warning label. Pepys was disturbed by it. Then, famously, and very humanly, he went to dinner. That tiny detail tells you almost everything. You can be unsettled and still continue. You can see the sign and still return to the table. You can understand that something is wrong and still not fully let yourself believe what it means. Modern psychologists call it normalcy bias, a tidy phrase for an untidy impulse. We expect tomorrow to resemble yesterday because most of the time it does. That expectation keeps life livable. It also keeps people in place a little too long. By July, London could no longer pretend. Death counts climbed past 1,000 in a week, then higher. By August, they were terrifying. Those with money began to leave. Of course they did. The rich have always been mysteriously more capable of discovering the health benefits of the countryside at exactly the right moment. King Charles II and the court withdrew from the city. Lawyers, merchants, physicians with country connections, anyone with a carriage, a purse, and a place to run to found reasons to be elsewhere. And everyone without those things stayed. Thomas the baker stayed because bread still had to be made. The widow stayed because widows did not have estates in Surrey to retreat to. Apprentices stayed, porters stayed, washerwomen stayed, children stayed because children go where adults can manage to carry them and no farther. This is one of the simplest truths in history, and one of the most important. Catastrophe is not experienced equally. The first people to escape are usually the people with options. Everyone else has to keep the city functioning while it unravels. By the time the Great Plague burned through London and finally ebbed, probably by late 1665, though the city would continue counting and worrying into 1666, somewhere between 70,000 and 100,000 people had died. The numbers are huge, too huge, really. Numbers like that can become numb, so it helps to shrink them back down. A hammer no longer heard from 2 doors away. A singer across the lane gone quiet for good. An oven gone cold. A child no longer sent to fetch water. That is what those statistics were made of. And London was not unusual. That is the real comfort and also the real discomfort. The last normal morning keeps happening. On December 7th, 1941, sailors at Pearl Harbor were eating breakfast. Some were still half asleep. Some were writing letters. Somewhere on the American mainland, families were getting dressed for church. Sunday morning has a very specific emotional texture. It does not feel like the edge of history. It feels like toast and buttons and not wanting to hurry. At 7:48 a.m., Japanese aircraft appeared over the harbor. The men below were not standing in a documentary. They were standing in a Sunday morning that had not yet admitted what it was about to become. In Berlin, in August 1914, crowds cheered war. Not because they were uniquely foolish, but because they were ordinary people without the benefit of hindsight, which is the most luxurious resource in all of history. Many truly believed the war would be short, home by Christmas, a phrase with a tragic little shelf life. They thought normal life had been interrupted. They did not yet understand it had been replaced. This is the lesson tucked under all these stories. The ordinary people are not extras wandering through somebody else's great event. They are the event. History lands on breakfast tables. It walks in through neighborhood doors. It reaches the baker before it reaches the king, even if the king gets the larger portrait later. Now, once people begin to feel that something is wrong, but before anything official has fully declared itself, a fascinating thing happens. The whispers start. They always start. Before the decree, before the broadcast, before the newspaper headline, there is a neighbor leaning in and saying, quietly, that something strange happened 2 streets over. Human beings are, among many other things, an extremely efficient rumor delivery system. Let's float south to Messina in Sicily, 1347. A busy port, ships coming and going, trade from across the Mediterranean, sailors, merchants, dock workers, priests, buyers, sellers, people unloading goods and opinions with equal energy. Into that harbor came a cluster of Genoese ships carrying something far more consequential than spices or cloth. Many aboard were already dead, others were badly ill. Authorities tried to push the ships back out, which was sensible but late. History enjoys being late to its own prevention. Now, imagine you are a merchant in Messina. You hear one version from a sailor. It is a disease from the east. You hear another from your wife's cousin. It is punishment from God. You hear a third from a man who always sounds confident and is therefore automatically suspicious. Nothing to worry about. Officials are overreacting. Which one do you believe? People rarely choose the explanation with the best evidence. They choose the one that gives them the most usable world. If it is a punishment, perhaps repentance helps. If it is overblown, then market day can continue. If it is just foreign bad luck, maybe distance will save you. Almost any explanation feels better than none. A blank space in the human mind does not stay blank for long. In medieval Europe, moral explanations flourished because moral explanations offered control. If plague was punishment, then behavior mattered. Pray more, sin less, process through the streets, confess, reform, do something. The alternative that an invisible organism was spreading with no respect for virtue was much harder to live with. But moral explanations have a nasty habit. Once people decide suffering must be somebody's fault, the next question is whose. Rumors spread that Jewish communities were poisoning wells. These accusations moved across Europe with frightening speed, often ahead of the plague itself. In some places, violence against Jews began before local outbreak conditions justified any panic at all. The rumor did not merely describe fear, it organized it. That is what makes rumor historically important. It is not just chatter, it is a force multiplier for whatever a society is already prepared to believe. And if that sounds medieval in all the least flattering ways, do not get too comfortable. The centuries change, the pattern does not. After Pearl Harbor, rumors spread along the American West Coast almost immediately. Japanese submarines off California, Japanese aircraft over cities, Japanese-American families signaling to the enemy from their windows. Most of it was false. Fear, however, does not check citations. It expands to fill available space. Within weeks, suspicion hardened into policy. In February 1942, Executive Order 9066 cleared the way for the forced removal and incarceration of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens. The rumors were baseless, the consequences were not. So yes, rumor can destroy. It can shove a frightened population towards scapegoats with depressing speed. But because history rarely leaves us with one simple moral and then politely stops talking, rumor can also save. When cholera reached New York in 1832, city authorities were slow to speak plainly. There was uncertainty, yes, but there was also the old and familiar concern that admitting the scale of a public health problem might be bad for business. Governments have returned to that logic so many times that it deserves its own antique frame. In the crowded immigrant neighborhoods of Lower Manhattan, people did what people always do when official channels lag behind reality. They talked. In taverns, churches, boarding houses, and along the street, information moved from person to person. Which houses were affected, which blocks seemed worst, which wells might be suspect. It was not perfectly accurate, nothing improvised ever is, but it was fast, and often fast enough to matter. That is one of my favorite little truths in history. The nosy neighbor may, in a crisis, become a public health asset. There she is at the window again, knowing everyone's business, annoying in peacetime, potentially life-saving in a cholera outbreak. Society owes a quiet apology to a great many gossips. What all of this reveals is simple and strange. When people do not know what is happening, they do not rest in uncertainty. They manufacture a world they can move inside. Sometimes they build that world from good local knowledge, sometimes from fear, sometimes from prejudice wearing the cheap disguise of certainty, usually from some messy combination of all three. And then comes the next question, the one that sounds easy when you are safe and well-fed and not actually there. If you knew something terrible was coming, would you leave? Most of us say yes, of course, obviously. Grab the children, take the money, get out. Very queen, very sensible. History, unfortunately, is full of people who knew enough to worry and still stayed. Not because they were stupid, not because they lacked imagination, usually because leaving is much harder from the inside than it looks from the outside. Take Pompeii in AD 79. Whenever exactly you prefer to date the eruption, because the evidence is annoyingly fussy on the precise month and archaeologists do love a spirited disagreement, the residents had warnings. Earthquakes had rattled the region for days. Water sources behaved strangely. There was unrest underfoot. But tremors had happened before. Vesuvius was part of the landscape. Familiar danger is especially hard to fear properly. It becomes background, just another thing the Earth does from time to time. Excavations at Pompeii suggest many people did try to leave. Many others appear to have delayed. Bodies were found near doorways, near valuables, in positions that suggest packing, waiting, deciding. Not ignorance, calculation. One more hour, one more trip, one more box. Human beings are astonishingly willing to negotiate with time as though time were a patient clerk behind a counter. And sometimes staying is not even really a choice. Warsaw, in September 1939, knew war was coming. The city had air raid preparations, people listened to announcements, they understood enough to be afraid. But what does leaving mean if your mother cannot walk well? Your shop is all you own, the roads are crowded, the train lines are unreliable, and the city itself is not just your address, but the shape of your whole identity. Just leave is excellent advice only when leaving exists as a practical option. Disaster researchers sometimes talk about a departure threshold, the point at which the cost of staying feels higher than the cost of going. The uncomfortable truth is that people usually set that threshold too high. They stay for pets, for grandparents, for tools, for one more paycheck, for the belief that it might turn at the last minute, for the hope that this, unlike all the stories afterward, is not going to become history. It is going to remain an inconvenience. And honestly, that is not irrational. It is human. Home is sticky. It is memory and routine and neighbors and the way the light falls across a room at the same time every afternoon. It is the shelf where the bowls go and the sound of your own door closing. You cannot pack that neatly, so people wait. They hedge. They tell themselves, maybe tomorrow. And sometimes tomorrow is still available. Sometimes it isn't. Which leaves us, at the end of tonight's first stretch, with the people who stayed. The baker in London, the merchant in Messina, the family in Pompeii, the shopkeeper in Warsaw. Not background characters, not fools, just people trying, with incomplete information and very ordinary attachments, to decide how to go on while the world stopped behaving properly. And once they stayed, once the door closed and the decision was made, or made for them, a very practical question arrived almost immediately. What exactly was for dinner? Because history can thunder all it likes about war and plague and social collapse, but by evening, somebody still has to put something on the table. And what people ate and how they made a meal out of almost nothing turns out to tell us more about survival than half the kings in Europe. So for now, let your mind drift there, to the table, to the kitchen, to the strange, stubborn dignity of people who kept setting out bowls in a broken world. And in the next part, that is where we'll go. So let's stay with that table for a while. Because once the door is shut, once the decision to stay has been made or made for you, history becomes very domestic very quickly. It stops sounding like drums and proclamations and starts sounding like a cupboard door opening onto almost nothing. It starts sounding like somebody asking, gently, what is left. It starts sounding like a spoon against the bottom of a pot, looking for a little more than is actually there. I used to think that in catastrophes, the big question was survival in the broad, heroic sense. Can the city hold? Can the family endure? Can the nation keep going? And all of that matters, obviously. But if you read enough diaries and household accounts and letters written under siege and plague and famine, what emerges is something much more intimate. The question that meets people every single day is not, can civilization survive? The question is, what are we eating tonight? And in a strange way, that smaller question contains the larger one. Because a society is not only held together by armies and laws, it is also held together by people who keep making meals, even bad ones, even absurd ones, even meals that are barely meals at all. Let's drift first to Leningrad, September 1st, 1941. The city was encircled by German forces, and what followed would become one of the longest and most devastating sieges in modern history. 872 days. It is such an unreasonable number of days that the mind tries to push it away. Not a long emergency, not a bad season, a whole alternate existence. Almost 2.5 years of hunger, cold, artillery, isolation, and the slow destruction of what a city had once been able to take for granted. By November of that first winter, the bread ration for children and non-working dependents had fallen to 125 grams a day. Workers got more because they had to keep the factories going, but even that more was not much to brag about. 125 grams is a very small amount of bread. When you picture starvation in history, it is tempting to imagine dramatic emptiness, but often starvation looks like measurement. It looks like people cutting tiny, exact portions. It looks like someone staring at a scale as though fairness could somehow add calories. And the bread itself was increasingly not really bread in the ordinary sense. Bakers in Leningrad stretched flour with substitutes and fillers, cellulose, bran, malt residue, cottonseed cake, and other materials that gave the loaf shape and bulk, but not much nourishment. The city needed bread, and the city would get something that could still be sliced and handed out and called bread, because words are very useful that way. Sometimes they help people continue a little longer than facts would. There are diaries from the siege that describe the daily ritual of dividing the ration with almost religious care. A mother would bring home the piece, place it on the table, and cut it into exact portions for the household, not one crumb wasted. Crumbs were gathered from tablecloths, from pockets, from the folds of paper used to carry the ration home. People licked the knife. They saved crumbs in jars. They planned the hour at which each tiny piece would be eaten. Because if you ate all of it in the morning, then the afternoon became a much longer and much meaner place. And then there were the things that crossed over from non-food into food because necessity has no respect for categories. Wallpaper paste, because older paste often contained potato starch. Leather belts boiled until they softened. Glue. Thin soups made from boiling bones again and again until the water held only a memory of nutrition. People learned which industrial materials had some possible calorie value and which were simply terrible ideas. This is one of history's least glamorous forms of knowledge, but it mattered very much. What strikes me is that even in Leningrad, even there, people tried to preserve the shape of a meal. They sat down, they used bowls, they spoke of dinner, breakfast, supper, language again doing some heavy lifting. The meal might be a gray liquid and a ration of bread that would not satisfy a sparrow, but it was still served, still divided, still shared, as if by preserving the ritual they could preserve the people having it. And quietly, that seems to have mattered. Historians and anthropologists who study famine and siege conditions often note that food is never just calories. It is schedule, expectation, hierarchy, comfort, memory, identity. It tells you who is cared for first. It tells you whether the household still imagines a future. A carefully shared crust can be a grim little monument to fairness. A mother giving the larger piece to a child is a moral statement before it is a nutritional one. In catastrophe, the table becomes a place where values are weighed, and usually not with enough to work with. Now, let's float west to Paris in 1870, because if anyone was going to turn a food crisis into a slightly theatrical civic performance, it was always going to be Paris. Of course it was. When Prussian forces surrounded the city during the Franco-Prussian War,
Paris was cut off from regular supplies. The siege lasted from September 1870 into January 1871. At first, people managed on stored food. Then they moved to horses, which, to be fair, makes practical sense. Horses are large, they were available. A city under siege tends to become much more flexible about what counts as lunch. But Paris did not stop there. By the later months of the siege, the city had begun consuming some of the animals from the Jardin des Plantes. And this is one of those historical details that sounds made up by a novelist who needed to calm down. But no, it happened. 2 elephants, Castor and Pollux, were slaughtered and sold as meat. Other animals met similar ends. There were reports of camel, antelope, even kangaroo appearing on menus. Because apparently, if you are Parisian and the world is ending, you would still like a proper menu card. One famous restaurant, Voisin, served siege-era dishes prepared with as much dignity as possible under the circumstances. Elephant consommé, roast camel, kangaroo stew. You have to admire, in a sleepy and slightly bewildered way, the determination. Not merely to eat, but to present. The city was hungry, yes, but it was also Paris. And Paris was not about to chew silently in the corner like a peasant from nowhere. It was going to put sauce on the problem. There were also less glamorous foods, naturally. Cats and dogs were eaten, rats were sold. Ordinary people, not dining in famous restaurants, improvised as best they could. But even there, the instinct was similar to Leningrad's in one crucial way. They tried to make food familiar. They seasoned it. They cooked it properly if they could. They gave strange things ordinary names. There is something so wonderfully human in that. If you cannot make reality normal, you can at least make dinner sound normal. That may not seem like much, but it is. It is part of the quiet psychological work of survival. A household that can still say, "We are having soup tonight," has preserved a little corner of order, even if the soup is deeply concerning. Now, if Paris shows us ingenuity wrapped in sauce, Ireland during the Great Famine shows us something else entirely. Not a short siege, not a sharp interruption, a long unmaking. From 1845 onward, potato blight devastated the crop on which a huge portion of the Irish poor depended. The potato had become central because it was astonishingly efficient. A small plot could feed a family. For countless cottier and laboring households, it was the food system, which meant that when blight took hold, there was no graceful fallback waiting in the wings. There was no second pantry hidden behind the first one like a reassuring stage trick. There was simply loss.
In the early stages, people did what people always do. They cut away the blackened parts and tried to salvage what they could. They hoped the next harvest would improve. They borrowed. They sold belongings. They stretched meal. They gathered nettles, shellfish, seaweed, whatever local knowledge said might sustain a body for another day. Relief efforts distributed Indian meal, maize from overseas, which had to be prepared carefully and was unfamiliar to many households. There are accounts of people trying to make it work in kitchens that had already become places of exhaustion rather than nourishment. One detail that always stays with me is the importance of the potato as routine. It was not just food, it was the rhythm of eating, the way a family expected to be fed, the ordinary stability of putting the pot on and knowing what would come of it. When that vanished, what disappeared was not only calories but confidence. The kitchen itself became uncertain. And unlike a siege with a visible enemy outside the walls, the Irish famine stretched on. Crop failures repeated, relief structures shifted, evictions increased, workhouses filled. People left. So many people left. Emigration became one of the defining facts of family life, which meant the table thinned not only from hunger, but from absence. A son gone to Liverpool, a daughter gone to Boston, a father dead, a grandmother in the workhouse. The architecture of the meal collapsed because the architecture of the household collapsed. That, I think, is one of the darkest things famine does. It does not merely empty the pot, it empties the room around the pot. And yet even there, in testimony after testimony, people remembered food with astonishing precision. A shared stirabout, a bit of milk, a potato from before the blight, described decades later with almost devotional tenderness.
The memory of ordinary eating became its own form of grief. People were not only hungry for food, they were hungry for the world in which that food had once belonged naturally to them. Let's move forward one more time to the Netherlands in the winter of 1944 to 1945, the so-called Hunger Winter. Rail strikes, German reprisals, frozen canals, disrupted transport, and the collapse of supply into the western cities created severe famine conditions. Adults survived on rations that fell, in some periods, below 1,000 calories a day, and then much lower. Families resorted to sugar beets, tulip bulbs, whatever could be turned with enough persuasion and boiling into something swallowable. Tulip bulbs have become one of those famine details people remember because they sound almost literary. But they were not literary to the people eating them. They were bitter, awkward, and in some cases irritating to the stomach. Instructions circulated for how to prepare them. Remove the skin, boil, try again, pretend this is cooking and not surrender. There were recipes in newspapers and pamphlets for crisis foods because society, even at the edge, likes a recipe card. It likes to believe there is still a method.
And maybe there was. Not a good one, but a method. If you zoom out across these cases, a strange pattern appears. People under extreme scarcity do not stop cooking if they can possibly help it. They stop having ingredients long before they stop having meals. There is a real difference. Cooking transforms. It says this is not just consumption, it is care. Somebody did something to make this more bearable for somebody else. Even a boiled tulip bulb served warm in a bowl is carrying more than nutrition. It is carrying intention. That is why so many survivors remember not only what they ate, but how it was given to them. The hand that cut the bread, the parent who pretended not to be hungry, the grandmother who somehow made the same bleak ingredients taste less bleak, the person who still put the pot in the middle of the table as though the table deserved respect. Hunger is physical, yes, but meals are social, and people are often kept alive by the social part just a little longer than the physical math should allow. There is also, if we are being honest, a very human hierarchy of what people miss first. It is not always what is most nutritious, it is what is most emotionally loaded. Butter, tea, coffee, warm milk, white bread, a little sugar, the completely impractical little luxuries that tell the body quietly, life is not entirely about surviving. During wars and sieges, diaries are full of longing for exactly those things. Not because people were foolish, because they were people. A Londoner under rationing in the Second World War might endure quite sensibly and still spend half the week thinking about eggs. A Parisian under siege might adapt to horse meat and still dream of proper butter. Someone in Leningrad might remember black bread from before the blockade with more tenderness than some people reserve for first love, which, frankly, is fair. Bread has gotten many of us through more than romance ever has. And all of this tells us something about endurance that I think official history often misses. Endurance is not one grand, noble act. It is repetitive, domestic, slightly annoying even. It is waking up and dealing with the food problem again and again and again. It is standing over a pot with too little to put in it and doing it anyway because everyone in the room still expects evening to arrive. The table, even a poor one, is a statement. We are still a household. We are still doing this. We are still here. But of course, adults were not setting those tables alone. There were always children nearby, watching, listening, learning what hunger sounded like before they had the words for economics or war or siege conditions or governmental failure, which children very rarely discuss over supper, being terribly self-involved in the way that they are. They noticed other things instead. The length of the bread line, the way a mother cut portions smaller than before, the fact that adults started saying, "This is enough," when everyone knew perfectly well it was not. And this is where the story begins to change shape a little, because children who live through catastrophe do not usually remember it the way official history records it. Adults remember dates and outcomes and who issued which order and what the newspaper said. Children remember the smell of a kitchen with nothing in it.
the sound of scraping the last bit from a bowl, the way a father tried to smile while saying he was not hungry, the odd excitement of getting half an orange, the shame of asking for more when there wasn't any more to ask for. Those smaller memories, the ones from closer to the floor, are often the truest ones. So in the next part, we are going to move into those rooms and look at history from that lower vantage point, not through governments, not through generals, through the children who were there, watching adults perform impossible competence with shaking hands and understanding far more than anyone meant them to understand. Because the child in the corner of the room is one of history's sharpest witnesses, and once you start listening to what they saw, a great many grand narratives become a lot less grand and a lot more real.
So now let's lower the camera a little. Not to the council chamber, not to the officer's desk, not even to the kitchen table, though that table is still there and still doing a frankly unreasonable amount of emotional labor. Let's go lower, closer to the floorboards, to the place where the children were sitting, maybe under the table, maybe near the stove, maybe in a shelter with their knees tucked up under their chin, trying very hard to act bored, because children often do that when something enormous is happening and they can tell the adults are trying not to scare them. The strange gift of children in history is that they notice what adults added out. Adults, later on, tend to tell stories in a way that makes sense of things. They remember causes, they remember decisions, they remember dates and speeches and what the government did wrong, which is often quite a lot. Children remember none of that first. They remember texture. They remember the smell of the hallway, the way their mother folded a blanket, the way a grown-up's voice sounded when they said, "It's all right," and everyone in the room understood that it was not all right at all. Children are astonishingly good at hearing the truth inside tone. That is why children's testimony, when historians bother to treat it with the seriousness it deserves, is so revealing. Not because children understand less, in many cases they understand the core of a disaster more clearly than adults do. They just understand it through the body first, through sensation, through the tiny details nobody thinks to put in an official report. Take Hamburg in the summer of 1943. The Allied bombing campaign known as Operation Gomorrah destroyed large sections of the city and created the kind of urban firestorm that sounds almost mythological until you remember, no, this was modern Europe doing this to itself with paperwork and fuel calculations and very civilized signatures on orders. Tens of thousands died in a matter of days. Adults who survived later talked about strategy, about shelters, about collapse and evacuation. Children who survived often remembered something else entirely: the air, the color of the sky, the impossible heat in the shelter, the sound of shoes on stairs, the way adults suddenly became both more serious and more absurd. One moment you are being told to hurry. The next moment someone is still smoothing your collar because apparently civilization will end, but not with a wrinkled child. Standards must be maintained.
Oral histories from those who lived through the Hamburg raids as children are full of these tiny, precise fragments. One man interviewed decades later said he remembered his mother braiding his sister's hair while the bombing was underway. Her hands were shaking. She kept braiding. That is one of those details that just sits in the mind. It tells you more than a paragraph of military analysis. Adults under pressure often cling to ordinary gestures because the gesture itself becomes a little barricade against panic. If I can still braid this child's hair, then I am still her mother and not just a body waiting underground for the ceiling to hold. If I can still button his coat, still tell him to sit up straight, still remind her not to chew too fast, then some structure still exists. Children notice that. They may not know the tactical situation. They know when a hand is shaking. The Soviet Union gives us an enormous archive of this kind of memory, though much of it stayed buried for decades in regional collections, family papers, school projects, commemorative notebooks, the sort of material that quietly piles up in archives while the big official narratives strut around in polished boots. Soviet children who lived through the Second World War were often described afterward as children of the war, which is both accurate and slightly unfair because children ought to belong to more than a war if anyone can help it. In those testimonies, something appears again and again. Children remembered not the exact moment of catastrophe, but the strange little pocket of ordinary life on either side of it. The morning before, the hour after, the school lesson that somehow still took place. A girl who was 9 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union later described going to school on June 23, 1941, the day after the invasion began. She expected, naturally enough, that school might be over now, that grammar had perhaps been canceled by events. But the teacher arrived and taught the lesson anyway. The girl asked if they were still doing school. The teacher said yes, they were still doing school. That answer stayed with her for the rest of her life. And really, of course it did, because for a child, routine is not trivial. It is architecture. Adults like to imagine that children need explanations, and they do, but what they often need more immediately is continuation. The lesson still happens, the shoes still go by the door, the hair still gets brushed, the spoon still goes in the bowl. Children can endure an astonishing amount if the frame around the day is held in place by somebody steady enough to hold it. This is one reason schools matter so much in every disaster, far beyond the academic content. Not because children desperately need arithmetic at the exact moment the world is ending, though honestly, arithmetic has seen us grew worse. It is because school says that tomorrow still exists. A lesson plan is a tiny act of optimism, sometimes a ridiculous one, but children can live inside ridiculous optimism much better than they can live inside chaos. And then there is London during the Blitz.
If any country ever mastered the art of packaging national trauma as a sort of grim civic inconvenience, it was Britain. There they were in 1940 and 1941, cities under bombardment, people sleeping in underground stations, and still somehow producing public messaging with the tone of a school prefect reminding everyone not to make a fuss. The children of the Blitz lived in a world of sirens, blackout curtains, dust, rubble, and ration books. But they also lived in a world of gas masks in cardboard boxes, school drills, and adults saying things like "mustn't grumble," which is not really an emotion so much as a national weather pattern. Operation Pied Piper, the evacuation of children from cities to the countryside, moved well over 1 million people in the early phase of the war. Children were labeled, lined up, and sent away by train, some with teachers, some with siblings, some with nobody familiar at all. There is something so heartbreakingly bureaucratic about those photographs. Rows of little children with small suitcases wearing labels like parcels. Society doing its best to save them by briefly turning them into luggage. Some children remembered the evacuations as adventure. New fields, strange accents, more food, cows, which to a city child could be an event. Others remembered unbearable homesickness, billeting with families who did not want them, different rules, different smells, an entirely different emotional climate. Again, the contrast matters. History often asks, were evacuations successful? Children ask, did the house smell strange? Did anyone tuck me in? Was there enough jam? Did I know where the toilet was? And honestly, those are excellent questions. A policy can be strategically sound and emotionally catastrophic at the same time. Governments do love that combination. Some children returned to bombed neighborhoods and found the geography of home altered beyond recognition. Streets opened up where buildings had vanished, familiar corners simply gone. It is hard enough for adults when a place changes. For children, whose sense of safety is often tied to the exact shape of familiar space, it can be profoundly disorienting. There are accounts from London children who treated bomb sites as playgrounds because of course they did. Children climb things. Children turn ruins into adventure because play is one of the mind's favorite ways of refusing despair. That does not mean they were unaffected. It means they were processing. Kids do not pause in the rubble and deliver solemn reflections on civilization. They make a game out of jumping a crater and then, years later, realize what the crater was. That same pattern appears in Warsaw, in Hamburg, in Stalingrad, in Naples, in Seoul, in Beirut, in Sarajevo, over and over again. children under extreme pressure continue to play. Adults sometimes misunderstand this and think it means they do not grasp the seriousness. Quite the opposite. Play is often how children metabolize seriousness without being crushed by it. A child turning scrap wood into a toy rifle or shelling peas with solemn concentration in a shelter is not failing to understand. The child is making the unbearable bearable enough to get through the afternoon. Some of the sharpest child witnesses, of course, were diarists.
Anne Frank is the most famous, and for good reason. But one of the things people often flatten in remembering her is just how insistently ordinary parts of her diary remain. Yes, she is writing from hiding. Yes, the danger is constant. But she is also annoyed, funny, self-aware, vain, irritated by adults, preoccupied with privacy, with quarrels, with being young in a cramped place full of other humans who have all become far too familiar. Which is to say, she sounds like a teenager. That normality is not secondary to the historical value. It is the historical value. The catastrophe did not suspend adolescence, it wrapped itself around it. Another child diarist, Tanya Savacheva in besieged Leningrad, left something much starker. Her notebook contains short entries marking the deaths of family members one by one. The bare economy of those pages is devastating, precisely because there is no rhetorical decoration at all, just names, dates, who died, and when. Children sometimes write catastrophe with the simplicity adults cannot bear to match. No framing, no theory, just subtraction. In Theresienstadt, children wrote poems, drew pictures, and kept notebooks. Many of those works survived even when the children did not. Some drawings show gardens and houses and sun. Others show barracks, guards, transport. Sometimes the same child made both kinds. Adults often want testimony to settle cleanly into one emotional register, but children are under no such obligation. They can draw a flower and a watchtower with equal sincerity. They can still be children inside a system designed to destroy childhood. That tension is one of the most painful and most important truths in all the history of war. I think often about birthdays, because if you really want to understand adults under pressure, look at what they do for children's birthdays in bad times. In ghettos, camps, besieged cities, refugee housing, bomb shelters, occupied towns, adults kept trying to mark the day. A candle, if one could be found, a scrap of paper, a little song, a piece of sugar saved for weeks, some horrible improvised cake that was mostly potato and hope. Very little in history is more moving to me than a bad wartime birthday cake. There it is, dense as masonry, tasting faintly of disappointment and rationing, and yet carrying an absolutely magnificent amount of love. Why do adults do this? Because children need proof that time still means something, that turning 9 is still turning 9, not just surviving another winter in a cellar. A birthday says you are still a child. You still have a place in the future tense. That is an enormous thing to give. Children, for their part, remembered these rituals forever. Not the grandeur of them, obviously, because there was usually no grandeur to be had, but the effort, the adult who found the ribbon, the teacher who brought one apple and cut it 6 ways, the grandmother who somehow produced jam from nowhere, which is how grandmothers often function in memory anyway. Part person, part illegal distribution network. A child may not later recall the military situation. The child will remember that someone tried. And trying, from a child's point of view, is often the whole story. There is another thing children notice with brutal clarity: the gap between what adults say and what adults feel. Adults like to believe they're hiding fear. Sometimes they're doing a decent job. Often they are not. Children pick up rhythm, tone, pacing, glances, the sharpness with which a cupboard is shut, the length of a silence after bad news. They may not know what the words mean, they know that something has changed. A father who speaks too brightly is as revealing as one who shouts. A mother who suddenly insists everyone eat at once has told the room a great deal without meaning to.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, children in the United States and Soviet Union often remembered not missiles or policy, but adults listening to radios more quietly than usual. During the partition of India, children remembered the speed with which trunks were packed, the urgency of adult whispers, the odd formality with which valuables were wrapped. During the Great Depression, children remembered parents saying they had already eaten when they had not. Again and again, children learn catastrophe first by studying adults. It is one of the earliest and most painful educations. And then, many of those children grew up and went silent. This is another pattern worth lingering over. Adults who survived catastrophe as children often spent decades not speaking about it. Not because they had forgotten, quite the opposite. They remembered too exactly. They carried smells and sounds and gestures with absurd precision, but they did not necessarily have language that felt proportionate to them. Or they had children of their own and decided, consciously, not to hand that weight down all at once. Silence can be trauma, yes, but sometimes silence is also caretaking. An imperfect one, a lonely one, but caretaking all the same. Then later, often much later, something opens. A recorder on a table, an oral historian asking the right question, a grandchild old enough to ask not what happened in the war, but what did your kitchen smell like? And suddenly the answer comes. Not the large, polished story, the real one. The basement door, the braiding hands, the grammar lesson, the half orange, the gas mask box, the little birthday cake that tasted awful and meant everything.
That archive of child memory has changed history in quiet but profound ways. It reminds us that catastrophe is not experienced only in headlines and state papers. It is experienced at the scale of the household, the body, the senses. A city may officially be under siege, but a child experiences the siege as a room getting colder, bread getting smaller, and adults becoming both kinder and stranger. And there is one more thing children reveal, perhaps the most important thing of all. They remember the people who kept showing up, not in the heroic bronze statue way, usually not those people. Children remember the teacher who still taught, the nurse who still washed faces, the neighbor who still brought soup, the woman down the hall who always knew where the extra blanket was, the gravedigger seen from a distance, the doctor with the odd clothes, the tram conductor who somehow kept the route going, the priest or aunt or clerk who stood between the child and total confusion long enough for another day to pass. That is what children notice in extraordinary times. Not abstract courage, presence. Who was there? Who kept coming back? Who did the ordinary task while everything around it became unordinary? And those people, the ones who kept stepping forward into risk because somebody had to, are where we need to go next. Because history loves to talk about leaders. Fine, leaders have their uses. But the people who held the line between the living and the dead were very often not the ones with portraits. They were the doctors with bad theories and good stamina, the nurses with too little sleep, the gravediggers, the orderlies, the women carrying water, the men hauling carts, the people doing work so necessary and so unpleasant that society preferred not to look directly at them unless absolutely forced. Which, naturally, is exactly why we are going to look at them, slowly, calmly, and with the respect they should have had in the first place.
So let's stay with those people that children remembered. Not the loud men in uniforms with excellent self-belief and deeply mixed results. Not the politicians issuing decrees from rooms that still had candles and lunch. I mean the people who kept showing up where the actual danger was. The ones whose work happened at the level of the body. The fevered room, the stretcher, the bucket, the burial pit, the corridor where somebody needed washing, lifting, turning, feeding, carrying, or simply not being left alone. History tends to praise these people later, once the smell is gone and the paperwork can be arranged into something noble. While they are alive and doing the work, society is often much less poetic about them. Very happy to need them, less enthusiastic about standing close. If you ask most people to picture a plague doctor, they will imagine the beak. Of course they will. It is one of the most memorable outfits in medical history, and also one of the clearest signs that human beings will continue dressing with total confidence, even while being very wrong about how disease works. The long dark robe, the gloves, the hat, the cane, the mask with the beak stuffed with herbs and aromatic materials to filter out the bad air. It looks like a raven got an advanced degree and very poor advice. Now, one little correction that history deserves here. That iconic beaked outfit belongs mostly to the early modern plague doctor, especially in the 17th century, not to the first great wave of the Black Death in the 14th century. People tend to blur all plague together into one giant gloomy cloud, which is understandable but not quite accurate. The bird mask look became especially associated with later outbreaks in Italy and France. So if your imagination just put one in 1348 Florence, gently escort him forward a few centuries. He arrived early by mistake. The theory behind the costume was miasma, bad air, corrupted vapors, poison in the atmosphere. This was not a ridiculous idea by the standards of the time. Cities did smell terrible, and foul conditions really did correlate with illness, just not for the reason people thought. They were seeing a pattern and getting the mechanism gloriously wrong, which, to be fair, is half of early science. The herbs in the beak, lavender, mint, rosemary, camphor, sometimes vinegar-soaked sponge, were supposed to purify the air before it reached the doctor's lungs. That was not how plague worked. But the heavy waxed garments and gloves could provide some limited protection against fleas and bodily contact, so parts of the outfit were accidentally helpful for entirely the wrong reason. Medicine has done this more than once. Humanity stumbles into correct practice for bad explanations all the time. It is one of our less elegant habits.
What interests me more than the outfit, though, is the job. Municipal plague doctors were often hired directly by city governments to remain during outbreaks and tend to the sick, especially the poor. Established physicians with wealthy clients had a mysterious tendency to become unavailable when plague arrived. They discovered urgent reasons to be in the countryside. Younger doctors, less prestigious doctors, barber surgeons, and men with fewer options were more likely to take plague contracts. Which is to say, some of the most dangerous medical work in Europe was done by people who were not the highest status practitioners in the profession, a pattern that honestly has never entirely gone out of style. The contracts could include treating patients, inspecting houses, supervising quarantine, performing rudimentary post-mortems, and keeping records. Some plague doctors also certified deaths or advised city officials on public measures. They were not only healers, they were bureaucrats of catastrophe. Somebody had to count the dead, note the symptoms, sign the forms, and walk into the rooms everyone else wanted to avoid. In Marseille during the plague of 1720, this became very clear. The outbreak began after the merchant ship Grand Saint-Antoine arrived from the eastern Mediterranean carrying infected cargo and, almost certainly, infected rats and fleas. Quarantine rules existed. They were bent, because commerce naturally had somewhere important to be. One of history's more persistent themes is that trade often gets one more chance right before disaster. The result in Marseille was appalling. Tens of thousands died in the city and surrounding region. One physician who stayed and documented what he saw was Jean-Baptiste Bertrand. He treated patients, observed symptoms carefully, and later published a detailed account of the epidemic. That matters. Documentation is one of the quiet forms of courage history tends to underrate. It is not as glamorous as curing the disease, which in this case no one could really do, but it preserves knowledge for the next generation, and sometimes that is the difference between one catastrophe and two. Bertrand wrote about the progression of illness, the failures of treatments, the practical reality of disease in the streets. He was not writing from the comfort of hindsight. He was writing in it while it still stank. That is valuable in a way polished later histories never quite are. He was giving posterity the unvarnished thing. Marseille also gives us another figure worth pausing over. Not a doctor, but a municipal official named Chevalier Rose, who helped organize the clearing of bodies during the height of the epidemic. This was dangerous work, extremely dangerous. He became famous for it because society occasionally notices the person doing the unbearable task when the unbearable task grows impossible to ignore. But for every one remembered name, there were dozens and hundreds of laborers, porters, cartmen, grave workers, and attendants whose names drifted away while their work did not.
And really, if we are going to be honest, the whole system rested as much on them as on any physician. Let's float over to London again, because London in 1665 had many moving parts and nearly all of them were grimly practical. When plague deaths mounted, the city depended on people called searchers of the dead, usually old and women appointed by parish authorities to inspect corpses and determine cause of death. This is one of those jobs history should talk about more often and almost never does. These women moved through infected neighborhoods, entered houses, examined bodies, and reported whether plague was suspected. Their findings fed into the bills of mortality, those weekly lists that modern historians rely on and that Londoners followed with such nervous interest. Think about the risk there. Think about the smell. Think about the way this work sat right between domestic space and official record. Searchers were poorly paid, often mistrusted, sometimes accused of carelessness or bribery, and yet the city needed them. Without them, authorities had less idea where the disease was moving. The whole statistical picture of Plague London depended in part on elderly working women doing appalling fieldwork with very little thanks. Classic history, really. Build your civilization on invisible female labor and then act surprised when the paperwork gets dramatic. Then there were the bearers and gravediggers. During the Great Plague, dead carts moved through the streets at night, collecting bodies from houses and alleys. The crews doing this work were handling not only physical strain and infection risk, but the psychological burden of repetitive proximity to death on a scale that no community is built to normalize. But normalize it they did, because there was no alternative. Bodies had to be moved, graves had to be dug, pits had to be filled and covered before the next day brought more. Parish records and contemporary accounts suggest gravediggers in Plague London earned unusually high wages during the crisis, supply and demand in its bleakest possible form. The work was so dangerous and so unpleasant that those willing to do it could command far more than in ordinary times. Some drank heavily, very understandable. Some used the money to support extended family. Some simply disappeared from the record once the outbreak ended, which is another historical habit we should be used to by now. The people who do the dirtiest necessary work are often the least likely to be remembered once the dirt has been swept away.
Daniel Defoe, writing later about the plague, captured some of this grim machinery in A Journal of the Plague Year. The work is a mix of memory, report, and literary shaping, so one has to handle it carefully. But it preserves the atmosphere of a city trying to maintain procedures while drowning in death counts. The dead cart, the watchmen, the shut houses, the burial grounds opening at odd hours, all of it gives you a sense of civic life reduced to its harshest essentials. Keep count, move bodies, try not to let fear dissolve everything else. Now let's shift from plague to cholera, because cholera did something medically very interesting and socially very familiar. It arrived in cities and exposed every weak point in how those cities worked, while elites explained the problem in ways that were often convenient and wrong. London in 1854 is where John Snow enters the story, and if history had any sense of style at all, it would have made him much more famous much earlier. Snow was a physician, quiet, methodical, and deeply unconvinced by the dominant miasma theory of cholera. He suspected contaminated water instead. This was not a popular view. In mid-19th century London, saying disease spread through water was rather like politely informing the establishment that the whole city had misunderstood its own filth. During the Soho outbreak of 1854, Snow did something almost absurdly simple and therefore revolutionary. He went and asked people where the dead had lived and what water they had used, house by house, case by case. He mapped the deaths. He looked for a pattern. That map of clustered fatalities around the Broad Street pump is now one of the foundational artifacts of modern epidemiology. At the time, it was just one doctor with a notebook doing the slow, unfancy work of paying attention. I love that about him. No dramatic laboratory reveal, no thunderbolt, just a stubborn man walking around a sick neighborhood collecting facts, while the city still argued about bad air. He took his evidence to the local board of guardians and persuaded them to remove the pump handle. The outbreak was already waning for several reasons, but the symbolic importance of that act has become enormous. One small piece of municipal hardware, removed because somebody had looked hard enough at ordinary households and seen what official theory had missed.
John Snow is often remembered as a scientific pioneer, which he absolutely was, but he also belongs in this quieter category of people who walked toward the danger because that was where the answer lived. He did not stay in an office waiting for theory to sort itself out. He went to the houses. He listened. He counted. He trusted ordinary facts over grand assumptions. There is something almost soothing about that, even now. And then there are the nurses.
If the plague doctor has the costume and Jon Snow has the map, the nurse has the long, exhausting middle of every crisis. The hours. The lifting, washing, feeding, turning, cleaning, soothing, writing for the weak, listening to the frightened, noticing the change in breathing before anyone else notices it. Nursing is the profession history routinely romanticizes from a safe distance and undervalues up close, which is a truly efficient way to reveal a society's priorities. The First World War made this impossible to ignore. Industrial warfare produced casualties on a scale that strained every medical system involved. Shell fragments, infection, gas injuries, amputations, burns, shock, exhaustion, trench diseases, all arriving in waves. Antibiotics did not yet exist. Blood transfusion was developing but limited. A wound that might be survivable now could become fatal then because bacteria had, as usual, no interest in anyone's patriotic feelings. British, French, German, Russian, and Austro-Hungarian nurses worked in clearing stations, hospital trains, base hospitals, converted schools, manor houses, convents, tents, anywhere beds could be fitted and some kind of system imposed. The British alone employed tens of thousands of trained nurses and voluntary aid workers. Many of the VADs were young women with limited formal training at the start, learning fast because there was absolutely no alternative. Trial by fire, but with basins and bandages. Vera Brittain is one of the best-known witnesses to this world because she later wrote about it with painful clarity in Testament of Youth. She began nursing in 1915 after men close to her had enlisted. What she encountered was not abstract service to king and country, but the repetitive, intimate reality of suffering bodies. The work was physically hard and emotionally relentless. Men cried out for mothers, wives, sweethearts. Men needed feeding. Men needed dressings changed. Men died. Then the next row of beds needed tending, because history does not pause for anyone's emotional processing. Brittain's account matters because it strips away some of the decorative nonsense that later memory likes to place around wartime service. Nursing was not all white aprons and noble profile shots. It was fatigue, blood, mud, bodily waste, loneliness, bureaucracy, and the peculiar ache of caring deeply in a system designed to process the wounded at industrial speed. And still they did it. So did thousands of women whose names are not on reading lists.
Nurses wrote letters home for patients who could not write. They sorted belongings. They noticed when a fever was turning. They sat with the dying so that death would not be entirely solitary. This last act appears in account after account and always catches me a little. The practical work matters enormously, of course, but the refusal to let a person die unwitnessed is a different kind of labor. It does not save the body. It saves something else. Dignity, perhaps. Company. The final proof that another human being stayed in the room. And because history cannot resist giving women impossible assignments, many of these nurses were doing all of this while also carrying the expectations of respectability, composure, obedience, and emotional restraint. Be efficient, be kind, do not collapse, do not complain too much, do not become difficult, and if possible, look reasonably calm while civilization comes apart around your ward. No pressure. We should also say plainly that not all of the so-called saints were medical professionals. In epidemics across the centuries, nuns, monks, parish women, lay brothers, neighbors, and local volunteers stepped into care work because nobody else was available in sufficient numbers. During cholera outbreaks in the 19th century, religious orders in cities across Europe and North America often nursed the sick when others fled. During yellow fever outbreaks, local volunteers and black mutual aid communities took on dangerous labor that white official memory later had a remarkable talent for minimizing.
Again and again, the people who remained close to suffering were not necessarily the people with titles. They were the people with obligation, habit, faith, stubbornness, or nowhere else to go. That is one of the least glamorous and most beautiful truths in this whole story. A great deal of human survival has depended on people who were not fearless and not famous and not especially prepared. They were simply present. And children saw them. They saw the doctor in ridiculous protective gear who still came to the house, the nurse who still washed faces, the gravedigger at the edge of the burial ground, the woman who still knew how to warm broth, the clerk who still wrote the names down. Children remember who entered the room and who did not. They remember who kept coming back.
Which is perhaps why, when those same children grew up, many of them became such careful keepers of letters. Because if presence is what saves you in the moment, memory is what saves people afterward from disappearing altogether. A person can be exhausted, underfed, frightened, and still sit down and write home, or write to a husband, or a mother, or a child hidden somewhere else, or to no one in particular, really, just to the future, which is sometimes the only recipient left. And that, I think, is where we should drift next. Away from the ward and the burial ground for a while, and toward the desk, the scrap of paper, the page folded into an envelope, the ordinary human miracle of somebody in the middle of all that dirt and noise deciding to say, before anything else, "How are the roses doing? And have you had enough to eat? And please kiss the children for me."
So now let's sit with the paper for a while. Not the grand paper, not the treaties and proclamations and official announcements that school children memorize and then promptly forget the moment the exam is over. I mean the other paper, the creased, stained, sometimes barely legible paper that traveled folded in a pocket or tucked into a boot, or handed to a stranger heading in the right direction with a quiet request to please see that this gets through. Letters. The kind written by people who had no idea they were leaving evidence for future historians. The kind written at night by candlelight, or in a trench by daylight that felt like dusk, or in a room that had just become smaller because someone was gone from it. The kind written to say, "I am still here," or "I love you," or "please do not worry," which is almost always a way of saying, "please do worry, but survive it somehow." One of the most striking things about letters from catastrophe is what they do not say. You would think that a soldier writing from a battlefield, or a civilian writing from a besieged city, or a prisoner writing from a camp, would talk constantly about the disaster. That seems logical. The disaster is everywhere. The disaster is the whole context. Surely the disaster would dominate the page. But it very often does not. Instead, the letters are full of gardens, meals, weather. How is the baby doing? Has the cow calved yet? Did you receive the last parcel? Did someone fix the roof? Please give my love to my mother. Please tell the children I think of them every day. Please write back soon. This is not avoidance exactly, or if it is avoidance doing something important. The letter becomes a bridge, not to the situation the writer is in, but to the life the writer is trying to remain attached to. If I can still ask about the roses, then I am still a person who cares about roses. If I can still remember the name of the neighbor's dog, then the neighborhood still exists. If I can still sign my name the way I always have, then I have not yet become unrecognizable to myself.
The American Civil War is one of the richest archives of this kind of letter, partly because literacy was reasonably high, partly because postal systems on both sides functioned with surprising reliability, and partly because the war lasted long enough for a vast correspondence to accumulate. Soldiers wrote home constantly. Their families wrote back. The letters crossed each other on roads and trains and rivers, carrying news that was already out of date by the time it arrived, but carrying something else too: continuity. The sense that across all that distance there was still someone listening. Sullivan Ballou, a Union officer from Rhode Island, wrote to his wife Sarah on July 14, 1861, 1 week before the First Battle of Bull Run. It is one of the most famous letters in American history now, though it was not famous at the time. It was private.
He did not write it for an audience. He wrote it because he loved her, and because he understood clearly that he might not survive the coming battle. What strikes me every time I read it is the balance. He talks about duty, he talks about country, he talks about the cause. But then he also talks about the Bluebirds song and the rustle of wind in the wheat and the memory of summer evenings. He tells her that if he does not return, he will wait for her in whatever comes after. He tells her not to mourn too long. He tells her he cannot fully describe his feelings for her because the letter would never end. Saladin Baloo was killed at Bull Run. The letter was found among his belongings. Sarah never remarried. She kept the letter for the rest of her life. I do not know what to say about that except that it is very human and very sad, and that the garden, the roses, the bluebird were not distractions from the serious content of the letter. They were the serious content. They were what he was trying to hold on to, what he was trying to give her, the proof that the life they had built together was still real, still worth naming, still somewhere underneath all the killing. The First World War produced an even larger volume of correspondence, and the British Army in particular organized itself around the mail with an efficiency that seems almost excessive until you understand why it mattered.
At the height of the war, the Army Postal Service was processing something like 12 million letters and parcels per week. That is an almost absurd number. It required dedicated infrastructure, thousands of workers, and a logistical commitment that tells you something about how seriously commanders took morale. Soldiers who received letters performed better. Soldiers who did not hear from home deteriorated faster. This was not sentimentality, it was observed fact. The letter was a tool, militarily speaking, for keeping a man functional. But of course, the men writing the letters were not thinking in those terms. They were thinking about mothers and wives and children, and whether anyone had fixed the gate yet. Harry Lamon was a British private who wrote home regularly throughout the war. His letters were later compiled and published, and what makes them so interesting is their relentless ordinariness. He describes meals, weather, minor inconveniences, the quality of the billets, the French countryside. He makes jokes. He asks about family news. He almost never describes combat directly. This was partly self-protection. You do not want to tell your mother exactly what you saw in the trench yesterday. It would not help her, and it would not help you, and the censor might cut it out anyway. But it was also something else. The letter was a place where the war could be temporarily set aside. A little room made of paper where Harry Lamon was still a son, a brother, a man with opinions about tea and socks and whether someone had remembered to send more cigarettes. The unsaid becomes as loud as the said, once you learn to listen for it. A letter that says only cheerful things from a place everyone knows is not cheerful is already communicating on two levels. The surface says everything is fine. The structure says I am protecting you from what I cannot say. And the reader, back home, knows both, knows the protection is happening, knows not to press, knows that the letter itself, the fact of it arriving, is the message underneath the message. Still here, still writing, still yours. Now let's move to a much darker archive, because some letters were written knowing they would be the last. During the Second World War, Jewish families across occupied Europe sometimes had hours or days of warning before deportation. In that window, some parents wrote to children who had been hidden with non-Jewish neighbors or placed in convents or sent to the countryside under false names. These letters were often left with trusted intermediaries, tucked into walls, handed off with instructions to deliver them later if possible.
Many of these letters survived the war even when the writers did not. What is remarkable about them is their tone. Not all of them, obviously. Letters are as various as the people who write them. But a striking number are calm, tender, focused not on the horror of what is happening, but on practical instructions and emotional reassurance. Here is the address of a relative who may be found after the war. Here is how to make a dish we used to eat together. Here is a joke you once told me that I want you to remember. Here is what I want you to know about who you are. These are not farewell letters in the dramatic sense. They are continuation letters. They are trying to extend parenthood past the point where the parent can physically be present.
They are saying, you will still have a mother, even if you cannot see me. You will still have a father if I am not there. The words will remain. The recipe will remain. The love will remain in a form you can return to. A woman named Etty Hillesum kept diaries and wrote letters throughout the war from the Netherlands. She was eventually deported to Auschwitz, where she died at the age of 29. Her writings were preserved by friends and published decades later. What Hillesum wrote is not what you might expect from someone in her situation. There is awareness of danger, certainly. There is grief. But there is also an almost stubborn attention to beauty. She writes about a jasmine plant outside her window. She writes about what it feels like to think clearly, to remain inwardly alive, to refuse to let the external destruction colonize her entire self. She wrote in one of her most quoted passages that she wanted to be able to live well even through this, not to survive it, to live it well. There is a distinction there that matters. Survival is the body getting through. Living well is something the soul insists on, even when the body's chances are poor. I find Hillesum difficult to read and impossible to forget. She was not naive. She knew what was happening. She chose, consciously, to keep attending to what was still beautiful and still true. The jasmine was real. The morning light was real. Her capacity to notice them was real. Catastrophe could take almost everything, but it could not take her attention unless she surrendered it. That is a kind of resistance that does not usually get called resistance. It does not involve weapons or sabotage or dramatic escapes. It involves a woman looking at a plant and deciding that the plant still matters.
Letters from American internment camps during the Second World War have a different texture, though they belong in the same broad category of correspondence from confinement. Japanese-American families, forcibly removed from their homes and held in camps across the western United States, wrote letters that often tried to maintain normalcy under impossible conditions. Parents wrote to children, children wrote to teachers, friends wrote to friends. The tone is frequently careful, sometimes almost formal, as if the writers understood that their words might be read by authorities and wanted to avoid anything that could be used against them. But underneath the caution, the letters are doing the same work all crisis letters do. They are saying, I am still here. They are asking about ordinary things, because ordinary things are the only container sturdy enough to hold unbearable feelings. They are refusing to let the camp become the whole of who the writer is. One letter from a young woman to her former teacher describes the weather, the dust, the food, the crowded conditions, all in matter-of-fact tones. Then, almost offhandedly, she mentions that she has been reading poetry. That detail sits there on the page like a small flag. I am still a person who reads poetry. I am still the student you knew. The camp has not erased that. That is what letters do under pressure. They insist on continuity. They hold open a little corridor between the self that existed before and the self that hopes to exist after. They say, the garden still matters, the poem still matters, the recipe still matters, you still matter. And the people who received these letters understood that. Families kept them, tied them with ribbon, stored them in boxes for decades. Long after the war ended, long after the sender had returned or not returned, the letters remained. Physical proof that someone had been there, had thought of them, had taken the trouble to write, even when writing was hard and paper was scarce and the future was not guaranteed. That is one of the quietest forms of love. The letter that says nothing dramatic, but says it anyway. The letter that talks about roses because roses are what we have left to talk about. The letter that folds up small and travels far and arrives crumpled and stained and is read so many times the creases start to tear.
There is a reason archives are full of these. Not because historians are sentimental, though some of us absolutely are, but because ordinary correspondence turns out to be one of the most reliable records of what life actually felt like during crisis. Official documents tell you what governments decided. Letters tell you what people had for dinner and whether they could sleep and how much they missed the sound of a particular voice. Both kinds of evidence matter, But if you want to understand catastrophe from the inside, from the level of the body and the household and the heart, the letters are irreplaceable. And once you have read enough of them, something else becomes clear. The same people who wrote letters about roses and poetry and whether the baby was sleeping through the night were also very often navigating systems that did not officially exist. They were figuring out how to get food when there was not enough food, how to get medicine when the pharmacies were empty, how to get word to someone when the official mail was not safe, how to survive on what the ration card provided, plus whatever else could be found, borrowed, traded, hidden, or quietly obtained from someone who knew someone who had access to something. The black market, in other words, the shadow economy, the place where all the rules everyone publicly agreed on quietly dissolve in the back room. That is where we should go next, because the official story of any crisis is always only part of the story. Underneath it, around it, woven through it like threads in a cloth, is the unofficial story, the one where people do what they actually have to do to keep going, the one that never gets a monument but keeps the monuments standing.
So let's talk about the back room. Not the council chamber, not the official distribution point with the queue and the clipboard and the person in a uniform stamping forms. The other room, the one behind the shop, the one down the alley, the one where someone knows someone who can get something and the price is not listed anywhere, and the whole transaction happens with a certain meaningful quietness that everyone involved understands without needing to discuss. The black market. Every society likes to believe it runs on rules. Laws are passed, prices are set, rations are calculated, distribution is organized, fairness is declared, and then, almost immediately, the gap appears. The gap between what the system provides and what people actually need. The gap between the official price and the price that gets the goods into your hands before Tuesday. The gap between how things are supposed to work and how things actually work when the shelves are empty and the children are hungry and nobody is entirely sure what next month looks like. Into that gap, with the reliability of water finding a crack, flows the unofficial economy. It has always flowed. In every siege, every famine, every occupation, every war, every collapse of ordinary supply. Within days, sometimes within hours, people begin finding ways around the official structures, not because they are criminals in any meaningful sense, most of them are not, but because the official structures are not enough, and people have to eat, and waiting politely for the system to catch up is a luxury that empty stomachs cannot afford. Let's start with occupied Paris, because if anyone was going to conduct a black market with a certain style, it was always going to be the French. When Germany occupied France in June 1940, one of the first administrative projects was rationing. Food, fuel, clothing, tobacco, soap, all brought under official control and distributed through ration cards. The system was meant to ensure fair distribution across the population. It did not, of course, because systems designed by occupying powers are not primarily interested in fairness, they are interested in control. But even setting that aside, the rations were simply not enough.
The official butter allocation for a Parisian adult in 1941 was something like 50 grams per week. 50 grams, that is less than 2 ounces. That is a quantity of butter that would not survive a single piece of toast in an enthusiastic household. You could technically survive on 50 grams of butter per week. You could not live the way French people understood living to include butter. And so the system developed. Farmers in the countryside began setting aside portions of their produce before the official collectors arrived. City dwellers with rural connections made weekend trips by bicycle or train, returning with chickens tucked under coats, eggs packed in straw, wheels of cheese wrapped in cloth and hidden in the bottom of bags. The practice became so common it acquired its own name, débrouillardise, the art of figuring it out. The skill of making things work by whatever means were available. There is something almost affectionate in that word. It does not sound like crime, it sounds like competence. The French regarded the débrouillard with a kind of complicated pride. Yes, it was illegal. Yes, it undermined official systems, but it was also proof that you could not be entirely conquered, that the bureaucracy of occupation could not quite reach into every back room and every bicycle basket and every quiet arrangement between a farmer and a cousin who happened to live in the city. The moral calculus was not simple, though. It never is. The black market advantaged people with connections, people with money, people with rural relatives, people who could afford the unofficial prices, which were often several times higher than official rates. A worker without spare cash and without a cousin in Normandy was in a much worse position than a bourgeois family with both. The shadow economy did not eliminate inequality, it often amplified it. The same crisis that drove everyone toward unofficial channels sorted people by their capacity to navigate those channels successfully. And there were profiteers, of course, people who saw scarcity as opportunity, who bought low where goods were available and sold high where desperation made customers willing. The line between resourceful survivor and exploitative opportunist was not always clear, and people drew it differently depending on which side of the transaction they were standing on. So, yes, the black market saved people, and yes, the black market ground other people down. Both were true simultaneously, which is the kind of moral complexity that official histories often prefer to tidy away, but that actual lived experience refuses to simplify.
Now let's cross the channel to Britain, because the British black market during the Second World War had a slightly different flavor. More apologetic, perhaps, more awkward. Very British in its particular combination of rule-following and rule-bending. Britain's rationing system, introduced in January 1940, was by most historical accounts impressively well designed. It adjusted for different needs. Manual laborers received more than sedentary workers. Pregnant women and young children received extra allocations. The system was administered by British officials for British citizens, which gave it a legitimacy that occupied France's system could never have. People grumbled, because people always grumbled, but there was a general sense that the rationing was fair, or at least fairer than the alternatives. And yet, by 1942, surveys suggested that somewhere between 30 and 40% of the British civilian population had purchased rationed goods outside official channels at least once. Not hardened criminals, ordinary people. People who followed most rules most of the time and then, quietly, on a specific occasion, did not. Nylon stockings became one of the iconic black market goods of wartime Britain. American production had shifted entirely to military use, making civilian stockings essentially unavailable through official channels. Women who wanted them, and many did because stockings were part of how respectable femininity was performed in that era, found other ways. Some drew lines on the backs of their legs with eyebrow pencil to simulate stocking seams. Some paid unofficial prices for the real thing. Some received them as gifts from American servicemen, which created its own complicated economy of favor and exchange. Cigarettes, though not rationed, were chronically scarce and functioned almost as a secondary currency. You could trade cigarettes for favors, for goods, for access. A packet of cigarettes in the right hands could open doors that money alone could not open. This is one of the recurring features of scarcity economies. When official currency becomes disconnected from actual availability, people find alternative currencies that track more closely with what is real. Petrol was strictly rationed, and the black market for it was brisk enough that the government mounted public campaigns against it. Posters reminded citizens that buying black market petrol was essentially stealing from the war effort. Some people were persuaded, others calculated that the war effort would survive their weekend drive to the countryside and proceeded accordingly. The moral messaging worked on some and not on others, which is generally how moral messaging works. What strikes me about the British case is the embarrassment. People who bought black market goods often did so with a certain sheepishness. They knew it was not quite right, they did it anyway, and then they did not particularly want to talk about it afterward. The national story of wartime Britain emphasizes solidarity, sacrifice, shared hardship, everyone doing their bit. The black market complicates that story, not by disproving it, but by adding a layer of human imperfection that the heroic narrative prefers to omit. Both things were true. People sacrificed enormously and also sometimes bent the rules when the rules became personally inconvenient. People believed in fairness and also, occasionally, decided that fairness could make an exception in their particular case.
This is not hypocrisy exactly, it is just humanity. The gap between principles and behavior is where most of us actually live. Now let's go somewhere much more confined, because the black market also flourished in places you might not expect to find a functioning economy at all. Prisoner of war camps during the Second World War developed internal markets of surprising sophistication. Men held in German camps, cut off from normal commerce and supplied irregularly by Red Cross parcels and camp rations, created their own economic systems with their own currency, their own traders, and their own logic. The primary currency was the cigarette. This makes intuitive sense. Cigarettes were portable, divisible, durable, and valuable in their own right to smokers. They could be exchanged for food, for services, for other goods. A non-smoker holding cigarettes was essentially holding savings. A smoker holding cigarettes faced a constant choice between consumption and exchange. An economist named R.A. Radford, who was himself a prisoner of war in Germany, later wrote a paper analyzing the economy he had observed and participated in. It became a foundational text in economics, which is not something you expect to emerge from a prison camp, but history enjoys these little ironies. Radford described a market that functioned with recognizable economic properties. Prices fluctuated based on supply. When Red Cross parcels arrived, the supply of goods increased and prices in cigarettes fell. When parcels were delayed, scarcity drove prices up. Traders emerged who specialized in arbitrage, buying goods cheaply in one part of the camp and selling them at a slight premium elsewhere. Some men accumulated cigarette wealth not by smoking but by trading, becoming essentially the merchant class of a tiny, confined society. There were even rudimentary credit arrangements. A man might borrow cigarettes against the expectation of a future parcel, paying back with interest when the parcel arrived. The interest rates were sometimes steep, but the system existed because it served a function. It allowed men to smooth consumption across time, to manage uncertainty, to operate as economic actors even when they had almost nothing to operate with. The camp economy was not perfectly efficient. Information was limited. Transport was constrained. The German administration could disrupt things at any time. But within those constraints, the market organized itself with a spontaneity that Radford found genuinely remarkable. No one designed it. No one issued a decree establishing cigarette currency. It simply emerged because human beings in groups, even under extreme stress, will find ways to trade. That is one of the more hopeful things history teaches, actually. Put people together with any kind of resources at all, and they will start figuring out how to exchange, how to specialize, how to create value for each other. The impulse is so deep it operates even in prison camps. Of course, the flip side is that the same impulse operates during exploitation. The trader who charges too much because he can, the hoarder who watches others go without, the person with connections who eats well while others starve. The shadow economy is not inherently virtuous, it is inherently human, which means it contains everything humans contain. In the Netherlands during the hunger winter of 1944-1945, the black market became a matter of literal survival. After rail workers went on strike to support the Allied advance and German forces retaliated by blocking food transport to the western Netherlands, cities like Amsterdam and Rotterdam faced severe famine. Official rations fell catastrophically. Adults survived on fewer than 1,000 calories a day, sometimes far fewer. People ate sugar beets, tulip bulbs, anything that could be turned with sufficient effort into something the body could process. In that context, the black market was not a convenience or a luxury, it was the margin between living and dying. Farmers who had food sold it at enormous prices to city dwellers who had money or valuables to trade. Jewelry, furniture, clothing, art, anything portable and valuable flowed from cities to farms in exchange for calories flowing the other way. The prices were predatory. There is no other word for it. A farmer who charged a family's entire savings for a bag of potatoes was exploiting desperation. But the family buying those potatoes was also, in that moment, staying alive. The moral judgment and the practical survival coexisted uneasily, as they always do. After the war, there were reckonings. Some profiteers faced social consequences, shunning, accusations, occasionally legal action, but the categories blurred. The farmer who sold at high prices had also taken risks. The middleman who transported goods had also kept supply lines functioning. The line between hero and villain ran through the middle of individual people, not neatly between them. This is the uncomfortable truth that the black market forces into the open. Official systems are necessary. They provide structure, fairness, accountability. Without them, pure power and pure luck determine who survives. But official systems are also insufficient. They cannot move fast enough. They cannot know enough. They cannot reach every back room and every desperate household. The unofficial economy exists precisely because the official one leaves gaps, and people refuse to simply fall into those gaps and disappear. The shadow economy is a portrait of people refusing to stop. Not always admirably, not always fairly, but refusing. Looking at what is available and what is needed and figuring out how to bridge the distance. Carrying eggs in a basket and hoping no one asks questions. Trading cigarettes for bread. Finding the cousin who knows the farmer who has the flour. Staying alive by means that the official record will later prefer to forget. And staying alive is what makes everything else possible, including, remarkably, the thing that seems least necessary and turns out to be most essential, the thing that people keep doing even when there is almost nothing left, even when every calorie is precious and every hour is occupied with survival, even when it would make perfect rational sense to stop. They keep making music. They keep telling stories. They keep painting and writing and performing and singing, which makes no sense at all and also makes all the sense in the world and is exactly where we are going next. So here we are at the last stretch of tonight's journey. We have walked through plague streets and siege kitchens. We have sat with children in basements and stood beside nurses in wards. We have read letters written by candlelight and watched shadow economies flicker into existence in back rooms and prison camps. We have seen what people do when everything falls apart, how they count breadcrumbs, how they braid hair with shaking hands, how they write about roses because roses are the only container sturdy enough to hold what they cannot say directly. But there is one more thing, one more pattern that appears so consistently across catastrophes that it stops being a coincidence and becomes a statement about what human beings actually are. They make art. Not after the crisis, during it, in the middle of it, while the shells are falling and the rations are shrinking and the official systems are crumbling and every rational calculation says there is no time for this, no resources for this, no justification for this. They do it anyway. They sing, they paint, they write poems, they put on plays, they tune instruments that should have been sold for food. They gather audiences in basements and barns and bombed-out buildings. They insist, with a stubbornness that makes no practical sense at all, that beauty still matters, that story still matters, that the made thing, the crafted thing, the thing that serves no survival purpose whatsoever, is somehow essential to survival. That is what this last part is about. Let's start in Leningrad, because Leningrad did something so improbable that it still sounds invented even when you know it happened. By the summer of 1942, the siege had been going on for almost a year. The previous winter had been the worst. Hundreds of thousands had died from starvation, cold, and disease. The survivors were exhausted, malnourished, grieving, and still under bombardment. This was not a city that had any business putting on a symphony concert.
But a composer named Dmitri Shostakovich had written something. He had begun working on his Seventh Symphony in Leningrad itself during the early weeks of the siege, before he was evacuated on Stalin's orders in October 1941. The Soviet leadership considered him too valuable to lose, which is the kind of compliment that comes with an escort and does not allow for argument. He finished the symphony in evacuation, but it belonged to the city. He dedicated it to Leningrad. He called it the Leningrad Symphony.
though its official designation is Symphony No. 7 in C major, Opus 60, for those who prefer their music with serial numbers. The decision was made to perform it in the besieged city itself. This required first finding enough musicians. The Leningrad Radio Orchestra had been decimated by death and evacuation. Many of its members had starved. Others had been conscripted. Others had simply disappeared into the vast accounting of loss that the siege had created. To fill the seats, military musicians were brought in from frontline units. Soldiers who had been playing instruments between combat were reassembled into something resembling an orchestra. The conductor, Karl Eliasberg, had lost so much weight that his baton hand trembled during rehearsals. Some musicians were too weak to attend every rehearsal. Some could barely hold their instruments. The bassoonist reportedly had to be helped to his chair. This was not a group in peak concert condition. This was a group that should have been resting, eating, recovering. They were preparing a symphony instead. The performance took place on August 9, 1942. That date was chosen deliberately. German forces had reportedly planned to celebrate the capture of Leningrad on that day. Hitler had allegedly spoken of hosting a victory banquet at the Hotel Astoria. Whether or not that specific detail is apocryphal, the symbolism was clear. The city was answering, not with artillery, though the Soviet military did shell German positions during the concert to ensure quiet, with music. Loudspeakers were set up throughout the city so that everyone could hear, and loudspeakers were pointed outward toward the German lines. The music was broadcast not just to the survivors inside the siege, but to the forces trying to destroy them. Here is what we are doing while you try to kill us. Here is what you have not taken.
I find that detail almost unbearably moving. Not the defiance exactly, though there is defiance in it. Something else. The insistence that the city was still a city, that the people inside were still people, that culture and beauty and the long tradition of human creativity had not been suspended by bombardment. The symphony was not a weapon in any practical sense. You cannot shell a position with a violin. But it was a statement that something beyond mere survival was still being protected, still being created, still mattering. The audience sat in the concert hall, many of them skeletal, all of them exhausted, listening to a piece of music that lasted over an hour. Some wept. Some did not have the energy to weep. The performance was broadcast across the Soviet Union and eventually around the world. It became one of the defining cultural moments of the war. And here is what I keep coming back to. The musicians who played that night were not superhuman. They were ordinary people who had been starving for months. The composer was not a propaganda tool, though he was certainly used as one. He was a man who had sat in a besieged city and written music because that was what he knew how to do. The audience was not performing patriotism for cameras. They were listening because listening still meant something to them. Art in extremity is not a luxury that arrives after the necessities have been secured. It is one of the necessities. Let's move to the trenches of the First World War, because the same pattern appears there in a different form. By 1916, the Western Front had settled into the grinding stalemate that would define the war. Millions of men lived in ditches surrounded by mud, rats, corpses, and the constant threat of artillery. The conditions were appalling in ways that contemporary accounts struggled to convey, and that later accounts have perhaps over-conveyed to the point of numbness. It was bad, unimaginably bad. The kind of bad that should have crushed every impulse except the most basic animal survival. And yet, the men put on shows. Amateur theatrical productions flourished along the front. Soldiers wrote sketches, built makeshift stages, scrounged costumes, and performed for audiences of other soldiers who had been fighting or resting for weeks. By some estimates, there were over 2,000 amateur theatrical companies operating across the British Expeditionary Force during the war. 2,000 in an active war zone, while men were dying by the thousands daily.
The shows were often comedies, often bawdy, often ridiculous. Men dressed as women for comic effect because actual women were not available, and because soldiers in every era have found drag inexplicably hilarious. The productions were not polished. They were not meant to be. They were meant to provide an hour or two of something other than war. But calling it escapism misses something important. The men were not trying to forget where they were. They could not forget. The guns were still audible. The mud was still on their boots. The show did not erase the war. What it did was create a small, bounded space where something else was also true, where laughter was possible, where a man could be an audience member instead of a target, where the identity of soldier could briefly share room with the identity of person who enjoys a good joke about sergeants. Historians who have studied trench culture often emphasize this point. The performances were not a break from identity. They were a preservation of it. The man who laughs at a sketch is practicing being the man who will laugh again after the war. The man who plays a comic part is rehearsing a future self who does things other than kill and try not to be killed. The art was preparation for continuation. It was saying, quietly, I am still someone who does this. I will still be someone who does this when this is over. That same insistence appears in places even more constrained than trenches. In Theresienstadt, the Nazi concentration camp in occupied Czechoslovakia that was used partly for propaganda purposes, cultural life flourished with an intensity that defies easy comprehension. The camp was overcrowded, disease-ridden, and served as a transit point to extermination camps in the east. The death rate was staggering. The conditions were designed to degrade and destroy. And yet, the prisoners, many of whom were artists, musicians, writers, and intellectuals, created. Composers wrote new works, musicians gave concerts, painters painted on whatever surfaces could be found, poets wrote, lecturers lectured. A children's opera called Brundibar, composed by Hans Krasse, was performed over 50 times by child performers. 50 times! A full children's opera with rehearsals and costumes and staging, performed again and again in a concentration camp.
Most of those children did not survive the war. Krasse did not survive the war. The opera exists now as a document and as a continuing performance tradition, but the people who created and performed it in Theresienstadt are almost entirely gone. I do not have a framework that makes that make sense. I do not think there is one. What I have instead is a recognition that the people in Theresienstadt were not creating art because they expected to survive. Many of them knew they probably would not. They were creating art because creating art was who they were. Because the act of making something beautiful was itself a refusal. Because standing on a makeshift stage or singing a children's song or painting a watercolor was a way of saying, this is not all I am. You can take my freedom and my health and eventually my life, but you cannot take the fact that I made this. That is resistance in a register that political history often fails to recognize. It does not involve weapons. It does not sabotage infrastructure. It does not delay military objectives. But it preserves something that the system of destruction was specifically designed to annihilate: the humanity of the person being destroyed. A child singing in a camp opera is not escaping reality. The child is insisting on a different reality, one where children sing operas, and demanding that both realities exist at the same time. That insistence is one of the most radical things a human being can do. Let's come forward now to something slightly easier to hold, though it carries the same essential truth. San Francisco, April 1906. The earthquake had struck in the early morning. The fires that followed burned for 3 days and destroyed roughly 25,000 buildings. Half the city's population was suddenly homeless. Tent cities sprang up in parks and open spaces. People slept on the ground, cooked over open fires, waited in lines for water and food. Within days, music was being played in the camps.
This is documented. Survivors describe informal performances, a violin here, a guitar there, someone singing. Within weeks, more organized entertainment emerged. Theaters began reopening in whatever spaces could be found. Newspapers reported concerts attended by hundreds of people who had lost their homes and were living in tents. One account describes a violin concert given in a tent attended by refugees who had lost everything in the previous 2 weeks. The writer noted that the audience listened with an attention and silence that he had never encountered in a conventional concert hall. I believe that. People who have lost everything are not dulled to beauty. They're often sharpened to it. The small perfect thing, the melody, the well-turned phrase, the image that lands exactly right becomes almost unbearable in its preciousness, because it is proof that something still exists besides destruction, that the world still contains this, that the part of you that responds to it is still functioning. The tent concerts of San Francisco were not a sign that people had moved on from the disaster. They were a sign that people were holding on. The music was a handhold, something to grip while everything else was falling. This appears again and again. After the bombing of Coventry in 1940, choirs sang in the ruins of the cathedral. After the liberation of Paris in 1944, orchestras played to crowds in the streets. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, refugees in camps organized performances for each other. After the siege of Sarajevo ended in 1996, the arts community that had kept working through years of shelling became one of the central forces in the city's reconstruction. The pattern is so consistent that it almost stops being remarkable, except it is remarkable every single time. The decision to make something beautiful when everything is ugly. The decision to perform something joyful when everything is sad. The decision to insist that this too is part of being human, even when being human has become almost impossibly hard. Psychologists who study resilience have noted that engagement with arts and creative expression is a consistent predictor of recovery, not because art heals trauma directly like a medicine, but because art restores agency. The person who makes something, even something small, is a person who is acting on the world instead of only being acted upon. That shift matters. It is the difference between enduring and continuing. And there is something else. Art is social. A symphony requires an orchestra and an audience. A play requires performers and watchers. A song sung in a camp becomes a song shared. The made thing, by its nature, connects people. It says we are still capable of giving each other something. We are still a community that creates and receives. We are still, in the deepest sense, together. The Leningrad Symphony pointed its loudspeakers outward not only to defy the enemy, but to include the entire city in a single shared experience. The trench theaters gathered soldiers who had been isolated in their individual terror and made them an audience, a collective, a group laughing at the same jokes. The children of Theresienstadt performing Brundabar were not only singing for themselves, they were singing for each other and for the adults watching, and for something beyond all of them that none of them could have named, but all of them could feel. That is what art does in catastrophe. It rebuilds the social fabric one thread at a time. It reminds people that they are not alone. It creates, out of nothing but imagination and effort and whatever materials are at hand, a small shared world that belongs to everyone present. And that, in the end, is what all of this has been about. Not the grand sweep of history, not the policies and the battles and the decisions made in high places, but the small shared worlds that ordinary people build for each other when the larger world is collapsing. The bread divided carefully, the letter about roses, the nurse who stayed, the neighbor who opened the door, the teacher who kept teaching, the mother who kept braiding, the musician who kept playing. Ordinary people living through extraordinary times. They are not footnotes to history. They are history. The catastrophes are just the context. The actual story is always about what people did inside them, how they fed each other, how they wrote to each other, how they held each other's children and buried each other's dead, how they kept making beauty when beauty should have been impossible, how they insisted, with a stubbornness that looks irrational from the outside and turns out to be the most rational thing of all, that life was still worth living because they kept living it in ways that mattered. We are here tonight because of them. Every one of us descends from people who survived something, who kept going when keeping going was hard, who found food, found shelter, found each other, who wrote letters that got lost and sang songs that no one recorded and performed small acts of courage that no historian will ever know about. They are not in the archives. They are in us. And the next time extraordinary times arrive, as they always do, as they always have, the question will not be what the governments do or what the generals decide or what the historians later write. The question will be what ordinary people do, how they treat the neighbor, whether they open the door, what they put on the table, what they write in the letter, what they sing in the shelter. That is the story that actually matters.
And it is written, every time, by people like you. So rest now. Let the eyes close. Let the weight of the day settle down into the mattress and drift away. You have spent a few hours with people who lived through things that should have been impossible and found ways to keep being human anyway. That is good company to fall asleep with. The bread is on the table. The letter is written. The music is playing somewhere, faintly, in a room you cannot quite see but can almost hear. Tomorrow will come, as it always has, and ordinary people will meet it, as they always have, with whatever they have, which turns out again and again to be enough. Good night.